Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. This is an enormously important verse, often known as the proto-evangelium, the proto-gospel, and it is building on the curse that the Lord God pronounced on the serpent in the prior verse. And so we'll spend a good bit of time on it. The translation is actually not that bad, but if you want to stick around for it, I'm going to get into some of the more fascinating ins and outs, particularly with the second half of the verse towards the end of the video. So let's dig in. Ke ekthron theso anamesan su, kai anamesan tes gunaikos, ke anamesan tu spermatas su, kai anamesan tu spermatas altes. And then we'll finish it here in a bit. We'll begin by noticing this chain of kai, or and, that nicely reflects the underlying Hebrew. This would be a very paratactic structure. I've introduced that term in a prior video. And let's look at this accusative. Ekthron here is from ekthra, and that means enmity. And it's accusative, so who's doing it? Theso here, the implied first singular. You see the sigma there. You see the omega ending. This is from tithemi, and it's referring back to the Lord God. It's a first singular future active indicative. So I will put or I will place enmity. That's the main operative verb here. And we see anamezon. This is a kind of compound preposition, if you will. And it means between, and typically takes the genitive, as we see here. So anameson su. So notice the genitive there, between you. And then notice how it's repeated. And again, this closely reflects the underlying Hebrew. The word bain, which is also between, is repeated multiple times. So it's between you and between tes gunaikos. Notice that is the genitive of gune. So between the woman, and then between tu spermatas su. Sperma here is offspring, as you may know. The underlying Hebrew is zera. And so it's between your offspring, that is the serpents, and between her offspring, that is referring back to the woman, or Eve in this case. So we begin the verse by noticing that God is going to put this hostility between Satan and the woman, and specifically between the offspring of Satan and the offspring of the woman, this unending, well, it will eventually end, but this perpetual conflict between the offspring of one and the offspring of the other. But let's see how it's going to resolve quite famously. Autos su terese kephalein, kai su tereses autu paternon. And so we begin by noticing this use of autos. This is very, very interesting. Notice it is the third singular personal pronoun, and it's singular, even though sperma and zera are typically understood as collectives. It's now the translator is interpreting this, and this nicely reflects the Hebrew who there, which is also the third singular pronoun. This offspring of the woman is concretized in a singular representative. And that's why, in many respects, this is understood to be an anticipation of Jesus Christ here. As the autos, he's the consummate offspring. And so what's he going to do? Terese. Now, this is an interesting verb choice that I'll come back to in a minute. It's from tereo. It's a very common verb. You'll probably learn this in Greek 1. And it usually means something like observe, perhaps to guard, or even to keep. And with the sigma there, the ei ending, the first instance is a third singular future active indicative. So he will guard or observe or something like that. Su kephalein, that is your head, speaking of the serpent's head. So he will keep or guard your head. And then you, again addressing the serpent, tereses, there's that verb again, only this time it's now the second singular form. So you will keep or observe or guard. There's a big debate about how to translate it. Autu paternon. Paternon means heel. The back part of your foot, and it's his heel. Now, this is interesting in a lot of different ways because tereo typically isn't a verb of violence. It's a verb of spying something out or guarding. And so we're kind of in an interesting situation here with the Greek rendering of Genesis 3:15 because it's almost like a messianic standoff, if you will. This future offspring is guarding against the head of the serpent, and the serpent is likewise guarding against his heel. it doesn't appear, at least in the Greek form, that anyone's necessarily winning. And that is very, very fascinating because tereo is just a very unusual choice. Well, let's dig in on that. And if you want to be done, that's fine, but let's get into it in a bit more detail. The underlying Masoretic, or the underlying Hebrew, so far as we can tell, is the verb shuf, and it's repeated. So there's a shuf here in the third singular, there's a shuf here in the Masoretic. So we have a nice matching there. And that word itself in Hebrew is immensely debated as to what exactly it means. It can mean to rub against, to almost like scrape off, or something like that. It's not used all that often, and that itself has created some translational issues. And so I kind of commiserate in a certain sense with the old Greek translator because the Greek word itself is rare and has a slightly strange range of meaning, but it certainly is a bit more violent than tereo. So what's going on here? Well, if you trace out the history of this, there's actually two options on the table for how that Masoretic, that Hebrew shuf, has been translated. One option is to do like the Hebrew did, because this shuf is repeated in both clauses, just like we see here in the Greek. Pick a word and repeat it, but pick a word that sort of works for both. And so from the Hebrew, like the ESV will say, he will bruise the head and you will bruise the heel. And I think King James says that and many others. Or the CSB says strike and strike. It's reflecting this shuf and repeating a verb that in both situations conveys a sense of violence as a way to map one for one with the two instances of shuf under the hood. We see the same type of choice, that is repeating a word, in the Greek as we've seen. The Old Latin does it, Philo does it, Cyprian does it. They repeat the same word to try to capture the fact that shuf in Hebrew is repeated. But there's a different option, reflecting the fact that it's kind of weird to have both parties do the same thing, the serpent and this messianic altos. And so the other option is use two different words, one for each. As an example, the NIV does this. And so they have this altos, this him, this future offspring, crushing the serpent's head, and the serpent striking the heel. Notice it's two different words to try to pick up on the activities of these two different parties. And interestingly, the Vulgate does this. They don't necessarily pick those two words, although actually the Vulgate's pretty similar to crush and strike, but they pick two different words as opposed to the same word. The Targums do this, and the Syriac Peshitta. So in the translational history and in modern English translations derived from the Hebrew repetition, we have two different options on the table. If you want to find out more about this, I wrote an article on this topic. It's in the Journal of the Septuagint and Cognate Studies, JSCS, came out in 2019, so you can see the details there and find it online. But let's go one step further. One of the things that I find fascinating about this verse, other than that translational complexity, is the fact that for all of its significance in Christian interpretation, particularly among those who are of the broadly Protestant tradition, it's never directly cited as such in the New Testament. You have Jesus talking about how you can trample on serpents, and you have serpents showing up here and there. And certainly in Revelation chapter 12, which I've already alluded to previously, you have this massive showdown between this woman who's giving birth to a male child. You have this dragon/serpent who's trying to devour him. And all that is modeled on the entirety of Genesis chapter 3. But this particular line, which is so significant in Christian tradition because it announces that this offspring of the woman will vanquish the offspring of the serpent, is never directly quoted, with maybe one exception. And I've shown it on the screen, Romans 16:20. Paul says towards the end of his letter that the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Commentators are divided. About 50% say that this is an allusion to Genesis 3:15. 50% of them say it's not. The basic idea of crushing Satan seems to fit Genesis 3:15 because we've seen that the ophis, the serpent, is later identified, for instance, in Revelation as the serpent. But if you look at the Greek here, hade theos, tesirene, sun tripse, ton satanan, hupotes, paras, humon, and tache, none of the words actually, not even a chi, because it uses de, there's no chi, none of these words match Genesis 3:15. So that leads some scholars to really question the idea that Paul has it in mind. Moreover, you have God doing the crushing as opposed to the altasi, or the offspring of the woman. You have feet being mentioned, and so on. That being said, some recent scholarship has argued that perhaps Paul is actually, at least with this verb, suntripso, perhaps alluding back to Genesis 3:15. Now, why is that? In some other videos, I'm going to get into the hexapla, but the tradition of Aquila and Symmachus, they don't use tereo. They use prostribo for Aquila or tribo for Symmachus, and both of those are much more violent than this idea of observing or spying out. The prostribo means inflict, and tribo means just afflict. And Paul uses suntribo, which obviously is connected to both of the root words used by the other translators. And Aquila and Symmachus are trying to get back closer to what they understood the Hebrew to be, and it could be that Paul is doing the same thing. Or some have even argued that there's a proto-Aquila tradition that Paul is echoing here outside the Old Greek, which had made this idiosyncratic choice. And so that has gained some traction in recent years, that he's not, of course, using Aquila. Aquila comes many decades later. But there's some earlier tradition that is trying to get closer to the Hebrew with this particular word, and Paul is echoing that. And so if you buy that argument, then maybe there is something to Paul drawing on Genesis 3:15. He's certainly familiar with Genesis 3 because he quotes from it in numerous other places in his letters. So I think there's a lot to be said for this option. We'll leave it at that. We've said enough. Genesis 3:15 in the books.